to understand what mass formation is if you want to understand the essence of totalitarianism. But as you said, as you just quoted from the book, people often mix up classical dictatorship with totalitarianism. And it's as I think you're witnessing now, the emergence of a new kind of totalitarianism, not the fascist or not the communist totalitarianism, but the technocratic totalitarianism, which is at the same time similar and different from fascist and communist totalitarianism. But as I think we witness the emergence of a new totalitarianism now, I think it's really crucial to understand what mass formation is and to be aware of how a totalitarian state emerges in a society. And as you mentioned already, a mass formation is a typical kind of group formation, which has a very specific characteristic impact on individual mental functioning. One of the most remarkable effects of mass formation on individual psychological functioning is that it makes people radically incapable of taking a critical distance from what the group believes in. So once people are in the grip of this process of mass formation, they will typically become blind for the absurd characteristics of the groupthink, of what the group believes in. And this goes quite far. The people who are in the grip of mass formation can truly believe the most absurd things, even if it concerns people who are usually highly intelligent and highly educated. That's something very characteristic. We could even say that historical examples show that the higher the level of education, the more vulnerable people are for mass formation. And also these people, highly educated, sometimes highly intelligent, tend to be capable to believe in the most absurd things. I will give you one example. During the revolution in Iran in 1979, if I'm not mistaken, there was a very large-scale mass formation that emerged in society. And people started to believe that the portrait, the picture of the Ayatollah, who was considered to be the leader of the mass, was printed on the surface of the moon. And every evening, when there was a full moon, people were looking up at the sky, pointing at the moon, and showing each other where exactly this portrait of the Ayatollah was printed on the surface of the moon. That's one typical example of something absurd, that the masses started to believe in. I could give numerous other examples from the large-scale mass formations that happened in the Soviet Union, in Nazi Germany, during the witch hunts, during the Crusades, during the French Revolution, and so on. But I don't think we have the time to give too many examples. But like that's one major thing: the strange, baffling blindness of people in the mass. A second important characteristic of mass formation is that people who are in the grip of it seem to become radically unaware. It is as if they don't realize anymore that they lose many things while being in the grip of mass formation that used to be extremely important to them. So people seem to lose all awareness of their individual, egoistic interests. People who are in the grip of a mass formation can lose everything, and the leaders of the masses can take everything away of the people who are in the mass formation without the people noticing it. A third characteristic, which is also very important of people who are in a mass formation, is that they become radically intolerant for dissonant voices. It is as if they are radically allergic, as if they cannot stand anymore that people think differently, or that it is as if they do not permit any individuality deviating from the group norm. That's actually one of the major effects of mass formation, and this can go quite far. People in a mass typically tend to stigmatize everyone who doesn't go along with the masses. And in the end, they typically give signs to the people who do not join the mass. And the ultimate step is that they try to destroy these people. And they try to destroy these people in a typical way. They try to destroy these people as if it is their ethical duty to do so. To give one example, again, of this kind of process, 2 months ago, I had a conversation with Shoreh Feshtali, a woman who lived in Iran during the revolution in Iran. And she mentioned that she saw with her own eyes how a mother reported her son to the state because she thought he was not loyal enough to the state, and how she hung the rope around his neck before he was hung. And she claimed to be a heroine to do so. So that's all these characteristics are really typical, characterize the strange process of group dynamics that we call mass formation. And once you understand, they seem really mind-boggling and strange, but once you understand the mechanism of mass formation, you see that from a psychological point of view, it's quite logical. I don't know if we have time to describe the mechanism of mass formation in a nutshell, but if you want.
I will give it my own layman's perspective based on the reading of your book, and you tell me how close to it I can get. So, the mechanistic worldview of the Enlightenment led to a feeling of meaninglessness in modern life, which has taken the form of a free-floating anxiety that manifests as an urge to fixate meaning symbolically down to a totalitarian level, which takes on technocratic flavoring because of the mechanistic worldview, and ultimately results in what we have seen manifest quite clearly in the past couple of years, but really over the course of the past century. Am I in the ballpark with that?
Yeah, yes. That's the gist of the book. But maybe we can describe it in a little bit more detail.
Yeah. That was quite a summary.
Yes, it's a broad line of reasoning, indeed. But as you said, indeed, like the phenomenon of mass formation became increased. It has always existed. It exists as long as mankind exists. But the last 3 centuries, it became increasingly strong, and it lasted longer. And that's indeed the fact that it became more powerful. The mechanism of mass formation is due to the fact that throughout the last 3 or 4 centuries, or at least that's what I claim in my book, and that's how I describe it in my book, during the last 3 or 4 centuries, we've seen the emergence of the so-called mechanistic view on man in the world, which means we became convinced, or our society became convinced, that the universe and everything in it is a materialist system which can be reduced to dead elementary particles, which all interact with each other according to the laws of mechanics. All atoms, molecules who interact according to the laws of mechanics, and which can be described as this entire mechanistic universe can be described according to the mechanistic view of man in the world in a strictly rational way. And it's indeed this kind of this view on man in the world that led to not only to a very rationalist, closed thinking, which isolated mentally individuals from the world around them, but it also led to an excessive industrialization of the world and an excessive use of technology. And that in its turn leads, I give several examples in my book of how this works exactly at the psychological level. This in its turn leads to people who feel disconnected from their environment. That's something typical. It's clear now that throughout the last 3 centuries, the number of people who feel lonely and disconnected with their environment, who stopped resonating with the world around them, is increasing progressively. And just before the corona crisis, this problem became really strong. Theresa May in Great Britain appointed a minister of loneliness because she acknowledged how many people felt socially isolated. And in the States, in the United States, the US Surgeon General also mentioned that there was an epidemic of loneliness, and something very typical. And so these lonely, disconnected people typically tend to experience a lack of meaning making. That's logical. I explain that in my book. Once you feel disconnected, you start to be confronted with experiences of lack of meaning making in life. And then, in the third step, as you mentioned, these people also typically are confronted with so-called free-floating anxiety, frustration, and aggression. That means anxiety, frustration, and aggression, which is not connected to a mental representation, or in even simpler terms, a kind of anxiety, frustration, and aggression through which or in which the person doesn't know what he's anxious for, why he feels frustrated, and why he feels aggressive. And that's an extremely aversive mental state. If people are in this state, they have the feeling that they have no control whatsoever when confronted with their anxiety, because they just don't know what they are anxious for. So in this state, when many people are in this state, something very typical might happen in society. If a narrative is distributed under these conditions through the mass media, indicating an object of anxiety and providing a strategy to deal with the object of anxiety, for instance, a virus and the lockdowns, anti-vaxxers and the QR code and so on, then there might be a huge willingness in the population to follow the strategy to deal with the object of anxiety, even if the strategy in many respects is utterly absurd. And the reason is, people participate in a strategy just because, in the first step, it gives them a feeling of a capacity to control their object of anxiety, and also, they also find an object to project or to direct their frustration and aggression on. So that's extremely important. That's the first step, the first psychological advantage. The second step is even more important. Because many people at the same time participate in a strategy to deal with the object of anxiety, people start to feel connected again. And that's the main reason why people go along with the narrative. Even if it is utterly absurd, they want this connection. People are intrinsically, essentially, social beings. And if they feel disconnected, they feel in the most aversive mental state, and that's cured symptomatically by the mass formation. I say symptomatically because a mass is a group that is not formed because there are strong connections between individuals. It's a group that is formed because there is a strong connection of every individual separately with the collective. So people in a mass feel a tremendous solidarity in citizenship, but it's not a solidarity of one individual to another individual. It's a solidarity from one individual to the collective, to the group. And that explains why, for instance, during the Corona crisis, people were all talking about solidarity. They were full of solidarity, and at the same time, they accepted that if their neighbor got an accident on the street, they were no longer allowed to help him unless they accidentally happened to have surgical gloves and a surgical mask at their disposal. It was written like that on the websites of the European government, for instance. And in the same vein, people accepted during the Corona crisis that when their father or mother were dying, that they were no longer allowed to visit them. And they did so in the name of solidarity with the elderly. That's the absurdness. That's a strange thing. So, and that's also the reason. So, in a mass, all the energy is sucked away, the psychological energy is sucked away from the social bonds between individuals, and it's all invested in the social bond of the individual with the collective. And that explains why people in a mass, or why mass formation and totalitarian states typically end up in a radically paranoid atmosphere in which the citizens are willing to report everyone, even the people they loved most before the mass formation, to the collective or to the state, if they have the feeling that this one individual doesn't show enough solidarity with the collective. So that's the strange effect mass formation has, and in which it is, that's important to mention, I think. Mass formation is not similar to hypnosis, it's identical. Exactly the same process happens in a hypnosis. In a hypnosis, there is someone, a hypnotist, who has a natural skill to withdraw the attention from the environment of someone else and to focus it all on one extremely small aspect of reality, for instance, a pendulum that is moving before the eyes of the hypnotized person. And consequently, after that, it is as if reality doesn't exist anymore, the rest of reality. And this goes extremely far. A simple hypnotic procedure is sufficient to make someone so insensitive for what happens with his body, for instance, if his attention is no longer focused on his body, that a surgeon is perfectly capable of performing an open heart operation in which he has to cut straight through the skin, the flesh, and the breastbone of the patient without the patient noticing it. So that's the strength, the enormous strength of the focusing of attention that exists in a hypnosis, but also in illusionism, for instance, and also in mass formation. And that explains, of course, why you can take everything away of people when they are in a mass formation without them noticing it.